Welcome to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today is day 95. It's a huge day. And I just cleaned off my camera lens, and I feel like there's so much clarity in the recording now. So today is day, like I said, day 95. Bible 365 means that I am reading through the Bible in 1 year, and I am sharing my thoughts every day. I am using the 1 Year Chronological Bible reading plan, which you can find at the One Year Chronological Bible online.com. Download the free reading plan, use your own Bible, read along with me every day. It's anywhere between 2 and 4 chapters, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And this is going to get you through the Bible start to finish in the entire year. If today is your first day, we are in the book of Judges, which is really going to put you smack in the middle of possibly a confusing area if you have never read your Bible before. So I always recommend to go back to the beginning, starting at Genesis 1, and then you kind of build up your foundation to move into where we are now. However, if you're here and you've just stumbled across me by luck, I encourage you to listen the first time, see if it is helpful at all for you, and then read with me going all the way back to the beginning. So my encouragement always is to read first, listen second, because the whole reason that I'm doing this is to encourage people to read their Bible. What we tend to do is we tend to just go and listen to what someone says about the Bible, which is great if somebody is really well informed, but it's not as great depending on their opinion, because we all kind of put a little bit of our own hearts into it, even if we don't want to. So like, my goal is never to make this about me or my life or my opinions of what God is, much more about what the Bible says about God to be true. And so taking those facts. However, I'm human, and I don't know all of the mysteries and all of the secrets, because we're just not privy to that here on earth. He kind of slowly doles out information to us as he chooses. And so I got what I got. And so I will share with you what I have, but you may have a slightly different perspective on the reading than I do, based on whatever it is that you, your background, your age, your gender, your socioeconomic status, whatever. So, not saying that it would be different. I'm just saying that your view and your perspective on it could look different. Anyway, coming from that, today is day 95. It is April 4th on your calendar. Do I have that right? Yeah, I have that right on my calendar. So it is April 4th on your calendar. If you are reading along with me and you have started on January 1st, if it is not April 4th for you, makes absolutely no difference. Keep listening anyway. We are in Judges, and we are doing Judges 11:29 through 15:20. So it's a really big chunk. There is a ton of things happening today. Some of it that we've heard and lived with before, and probably one of those big Bible stories that we've heard of before, and some of it not as much. So some of it could be a little bit of a repeat, but not necessarily. Just a little taste of what is in the book of Judges. Judges is this time in Israel where Moses has taken the Israelites out of Egypt, which was a few hundred years before this. Moses has taken the Israelites out of Egypt at this point, and they were slaves in Egypt, and God has chosen this people group, which is the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, the 12 tribes, and he's led them out of Egypt, out of slavery, into their own land, which was not earned by them. They were other people living in that land. God has chosen to put them in that land. He calls this his land, the land of milk and honey, which means it's sort of like a pretty great land. And it says it's really land flowing with milk and honey. So I don't want to say that it's land of milk and honey. It's flowing with milk and honey. So it's got an abundant food, animals, right, crops, all these kind of things. And so he has brought them there, and Moses was first, and then Joshua was their next leader after Moses died. Joshua brought them into the land of Canaan, and then Joshua died, and now they are sort of in a time where there really is no leader of the Israelite people group as the 12 tribes. So there's no overall 12 tribes leader in the land at this time. And in some ways, it's creating a little bit of chaos in the land. And so all areas are a little bit divided. No one's fully invested. There are a couple, like Joseph's sons, which are Ephraim and Manasseh. They sort of seem to be connected, but maybe a little bit disconnected from maybe Judah, right? And they're on two different sides of the Jordan. So there are 2.5 tribes on the west side of the Jordan. The rest are on the east side of the Jordan. I think that's the other way. There are 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. All the rest is on the west side of the Jordan. And so there's some division there, right? Because they're divided by the Jordan. And so they're not really connected super as a people group. And it's leading to them turning to a lot of their evil ways, which means they're turning away from God. And that's where we find them. Now, what is happening is when Israel as a nation starts to lament and to cry out, and they're kind of overwhelmed by the people that are still living in the land, whether it be the Canaanites or the Philistines or the Amorites or the Ammonites, right? There's all these people surrounding them, and there are all these people sort of living still in the land that were supposed to be gone. Whenever any of those build up and overtake Israel for a significant period of time, Israel starts to cry out to God. Hey, God, we turned away from you. We're really so sorry. Can we turn back to you? Because we love you and we know you're the Lord and we want to follow you. And then God lifts up someone that he calls a judge. And that judge sort of takes care of whatever's happening in the land at the time. And then they rule. Then the Israelites are in charge for a period of time that judge is alive. We have had several judges at this point. Each one has lived for different periods of time. Some of them are 40 years, some are 5, some are 7, right? So it lives significant, different periods of time. And then when they die, the land goes back into being overrun again. So we're on Jephthah is the judge that we're with now. And it is in Judges 11. And so I'm going to start there. Here we go. Judges 11 starts with verse 29. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. So Jephthah was one of the guys who they asked, they said, can you lead us into battle? And then if you lead us in battle, then you can rule over us. And he said, are you sure? And they said, yes. And so now he's ruling over them. He led them in the battle. He won battles, and he's now leading them as the Israelites. And then so in verse 29, it says this, now he's going against the king of Ammon. The Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there advanced against the Ammonites. So I want to give very brief geography. Gilead is not one of the 12 tribes, but Gilead is in the land of Manasseh, which is one of the 12 tribes. So I was fascinated with why Gilead sort of gets its own area, its own land. And it's a really big area in the tribe of Manasseh. And so we're going to come to a little bit near the end why this happens. But Gilead is taken from inside Manasseh, right? So I just geographically, so we understand where it is in Manasseh. It is on the other side of the Jordan in Manasseh, which would now be considered, I believe, actually Jordan, the territory of Jordan. And so, anyway, so this is where we are geographically. So we kind of go through Gilead, which is in Manasseh, and then through Manasseh. All right, so then he makes this vow to the Lord. And if you guys remember, vows were really important. You weren't to take a vow unless you were to follow through on your vow. So he takes a vow to the Lord, and he says, if you give me the Ammonites, then, and I'm not sure why he made this vow, but he says, whatever comes out of my door, I'm going to offer that as burnt offerings. And so I feel like I'm already prepared that it's going to be something weird that comes out the door, because why would you offer to make a burnt offering out of anything that comes out of your front door? I would assume my family is coming out of my front door. So I'm not really sure. So I feel like historically, possibly, he would have assumed an animal would be coming out of his door, because I think that would be the only reason that he would offer it as a burnt offering, would be that some type of animal, whether it be cows or goats or sheep or whatever it would be some kind of animal that would be the first thing to greet him coming out the front door. So it says, when I return in triumph, or it says, whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph will be yours. So, and I'm making that assumption. I'm not 100% sure, but by his reaction, I feel like that's a qualified assumption. So, of course, what comes out the door when he wins, because the Lord gives the Ammonites into his hands, and what comes out the door is his daughter. And it is his only daughter, and it is his only child, and she is still a virgin. And so she is the thing that comes out the door. And of course, as soon as he sees her, he's tearing his clothes and he's weeping. And obviously he didn't mean his daughter, but he made a vow to the Lord, and they're taken very seriously. It's not like nowadays when we promise something, unfortunately, it's really easy for us to turn back on our promises. but this was something that God spoke of in the very beginning. You make a vow, you did a burnt offering or some kind of offering for your vow, and you needed to keep that vow. And I believe, and I'm not 100% sure if I remember correctly, I should have looked, but if you don't follow through on that vow, you can be stoned to death. And so there is a consequence to making a vow to the Lord for something and then not following through on that vow. So once the girl comes out and she finds out that it's her, she says, I'm willing to do it. So she willingly sacrifices herself. He obviously is devastated, but she probably understands what that sacrifice means, what the offering was, what the vow is. And so she says, I'm willing to sacrifice myself. Let me just go with my sisters and other women in the tribe for a couple of months so we can weep together, because I've never been with a man, and this will be sort of the end of my life. And so she goes up for 2 months, her and several other her women, they all weep together. And then she comes back down, and then it says he followed through on his vow. So I was curious about, because then it says that they every year now they celebrate this. And so I was really curious about looking that up, what that meant. And they don't still continue that tradition. So it seems like it's been a lost tradition. So it was done for a time, but it is no longer done anymore. Although it also seems that they are trying to bring it back, but bring it back in a slightly different way. So this is just some of the stuff I looked up for like historical information. They're trying to bring it back as sort of like women celebrating together. But in that, I was reading that a lot of people actually think that he didn't sacrifice her and offer her as burnt offerings, that he just kept her a virgin. I'm only going to argue that I think that he wouldn't have lamented in the way that he did if that were true. Now, I'm sure it would be sad, because then he wouldn't have children or grandchildren, right? However, I think the major portion of the sacrifice and what was promised, unfortunately, to the Lord was her death and burnt offerings. And now, of course, we're going to look at that and we're going to say, why would a God accept the daughter, her death, as a burnt offering? And I'm going to say it's much more about the promise that was made and not necessarily about the life, which probably seems really callous, except that and it does, and it feels callous. And certainly I can say that if that were a vow that I made, I would be regretting that vow. And I would, and of course it's a lesson like, oh, what kind of vows do we make to the Lord, right? I think he made the vow in sincerity. And I think he really trusted that the Lord was going to honor that vow. And so therefore he also had to honor that vow. And it was a major sacrifice. So what we see, instead of going, well, I need to really rethink my vows, what we see is when the Israelites trust and believe in God, and they believe in his truths, and they believe in the power of what he does, they honor the vows that they made. And so I think to look honorably on the sacrifice he made, I think is bigger, and it's a better understanding of the way he believed in God and the Lord, right? And so I even want to say that I want to be sure. I want to be more careful of saying the Lord, because it's one thing to believe in a deity. It's another thing to believe that the Lord, our Lord, is God, right? And that's the God that we follow. So I think his belief and his faith in the genuine Lord, in the Lord and the one true God, is what's really important to take away here. As much as it hurts that we would go, why would God even want to take her? Well, he promised her, right? He made that choice. He made that vow. He made that promise to the Lord. And therefore, to honor it is to honor the Lord. And then the Lord honored it by accepting that burnt offering, right? So that's an honor that the Lord made, not detesting what he sacrificed, right? So I think that in many ways, it's to be looked at as it's a good thing, even as much as it pains our heart to do that. And boy, do I feel like I say that a lot, because sometimes we just really need to rethink our some of the stuff that goes on internally, right? Because we always believe what we believe is good, and then that's not necessarily true of God. So, and it's a hard pill to swallow, no matter what we do. All right, so moving on to Judges 12. This I thought was just interesting. So Ephraim once again says, why didn't you let me know that you guys were going to go take the Amorites? And so I don't know if you guys remember, but if we go back to Judges 8:1, they did the same thing. So I got to move back into my pages a little bit. Bear with me. So in Judges 8:1, it says this is with Gideon. And Gideon, if you guys remember, took over an area and he didn't invite the Ephraimites until near the end. And then they said, now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian? And they challenged him vigorously. So that was Gideon, which was some time ago, a few generations, like 40 plus years ago. And then here we are. Ephraim does the same thing. It says, verse 1, the Ephraimite forces were called out and they crossed over to Japhan and said to Jephthah, why did you go and fight the Amorites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn your house down over your head. So now we have infighting because maybe they felt like they weren't honored, whatever it might be. Now Ephraim is threatening to burn their house down. And then Ephraim then calls them renegades, which another word for a renegade is a deserter. So remember I said that Gilead was in the middle of Manasseh, but it looks like Gilead is full of Manassites, and Ephraimites. I don't know what we can call them, but the people of Ephraim and the people of Manasseh, there's kind of a mix and a jumble of them living in Gilead. And so they're saying that they are renegades, they're deserters from those two tribes, and they've sort of made their own area. And possibly that's true. Possibly they did turn slightly away, and then they, obviously Jephthah came up as that judge and was judging the area based on that. However, God was still with them, still with Jephthah, and so then they killed some Ephraimites, and then the Ephraimites were trying to come over into their land, and based on the way that they spoke, the Gileadites could tell which way they were. Like, are you from Ephraim or are you from Gilead? And then everyone that came over that had an accent in a certain way, they killed them. And so they killed 42,000 people of because of that. They wouldn't let him cross over the border. So then Jephthah rules for 6 years, and then he dies. So I'm going to go down and read. The next person is Ibzan of Bethlehem. So if I go to verse 8, it says, after him, Ibzan of Bethlehem led Israel. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and then he gave his daughters away to marry people outside of their clan, and then he gave his sons away, or brought in women outside of their clan to marry the sons, which was something that they weren't really supposed to do. I don't want to say it was the law, but it was just something they were mostly supposed to stay in clan, and they were building up in ways they were blessing their own territory by marrying inside of their own tribes. And so I'm going to say it wasn't a commandment. However, it was a tradition. I might have blurred that a little bit, but in general, they were mostly marrying inside their clan, and they weren't really supposed to marry outside of their clan. It doesn't say anything more than that. So it doesn't necessarily, God's not really condemning it, but we're also not saying that that was something that they were supposed to do either. So then we move on, and he led for 7 years. And then we move on, verse 11, it says, Elon the Zebulunite led Israel for 10 years, and then he died. So we don't really get a whole lot of information from him. And then in verse 13 it says, after him, Abdon, son of Hillel, led Israel, and he was in Ephraim. He had 40 sons and grandsons. So again, it looks like they were blessed. They had a lot of things. They had a lot of money. They had a lot of area, land, territory, all those kind of things. And so it looks like he was blessed, and he was the next judge. And then after that, we get to sort of the big story. Not quite Samson and Delilah, but we're going to meet Samson. And so we move into Judges 13. So Israelites did evil. They were not following the Lord. So they had lived for a certain amount of time with each of these judges. And then again, slowly but surely, they start turning away from the Lord. And it says, did evil in the eyes. And then the Lord delivered them in the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So they had a small amount of prosperity. And now 40 years, they are under the power of the Philistines. So, which is obviously not great for the Israelites. So Samson is born. And I want to kind of go right into Samson being born. In verse 2, it says, a certain man of Zorah. So this guy is from Dan, the tribe of Dan. and he and his wife cannot have children, so she is barren. And then I'm going to read 5 through 7 because there's some really confusing areas in here. So the wife is going to get pregnant, but she has to abstain from wine, and she has to only eat clean foods. Uh, he's going to be a Nazarite. Now, this is something uh, to go back a little bit to the Nazarite vow was in Numbers, and so number 6. And so the Nazarites we didn't get a whole lot of information of how they got the name or anything like that, but what we knew is that they made a vow to the Lord, the Nazarites. They would make a vow to the Lord. They would go live in a certain area, and they would not shave their heads, right? So they would let their hair grow, whether it was a woman or a man, they would let their hair grow. It wasn't to be touched, and they would abstain from anything related to grapes. So nothing fermented, nothing with the vine, right? So they weren't allowed to do any of those things. This was to keep them clean and pure while they were under the vow of the Lord, right? So, and it could be for any number of time. It could be a year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 months, whatever it was. They would make that vow, and then they would be Nazarites. And then they would, when they were done the vow, then shave their heads, and they were done with the vow, the vow that they promised to the Lord. Samson, however, was considered a Nazarite by God, was considered a Nazarite from birth. And so, I'm sorry, from the womb. So actually not from birth. And so the reason that she was made to abstain from all of these things is because anything that she took in, he would take in. And because he was in the womb, they wanted him to remain a Nazarite, it looks like all throughout. Because he was in the womb, then she couldn't do any of these things. So she couldn't drink any fermented drinks. She had to do everything to keep herself clean. So I don't think I ever noticed that before, but I thought that was really fascinating that whatever comes in from her then goes to him. And it was even before he was born, he was a Nazarite. So, and in verse 8 it says, then Manoah prayed to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to come to us again to teach us how to bring up the boy that is born. So she went back. She met with the angel. She went back and told her husband everything that happened. And then her husband, Manoah, prays to the Lord to find out how to raise him. So like this is obviously a unique situation. And so he needed help with understanding how they would take care of this son when he was born. And the one thing that I want to note was the one thing that I noticed that I wanted to note is sort of the idea of an angel and what the angels do. So it looks very much in this situation and in past situations that we've had that the angel is a messenger. So he comes down and he speaks for the Lord. He gives messages from the Lord to the people. They don't necessarily always know. He doesn't necessarily always say that he's an angel. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. But they do give a message from the Lord. And so we're going to see that I think Manoah, well, I know that Manoah doesn't necessarily understand who this person is and what the whole point and purpose is. All right. So anyway, so he's praying in 8, and then the angel, so then God hears him, and then the angel comes again to the woman. Her husband again wasn't with her, and so she goes to get him and brings him back. So I feel like she's just a little bit more clear on who he is. So in verse 11, he says, are you the man that talked to my wife? And he says, yes, I am. So then he says, when your words are fulfilled, how am I supposed to take care of this boy? And the angel says, your wife has to do everything that I told her. So he doesn't answer that question. He just says that your wife has to keep clean. So is there something about what she does that helps create Samson in the way that he is, right? And then helps them to govern him older. But anyway, so it says she has to do everything I commanded her. And then he invites him to stay and eat. And because he doesn't really understand that he's an angel, and the Lord says, or the angel says, I'll stay here, but I'm not going to eat anything, but we can offer it to the Lord. So they bring it, they offer it to the Lord, fire comes up, and then the angel ascends in the fire. And then the guy, and the husband, it's just such a funny reaction. The husband then says in verse 22, he says, we're doomed to die. We've seen God. So there's, I guess, an assumption through all the people that seeing God, because we remember back with Moses in Exodus, even Moses couldn't see the full glory of God. He saw most of it. He saw almost everything, but he couldn't see his face. But they say, we can't see God, and so we're going to die. even though the Lord has sent the angel to come and promise them to have a son. So they're not going to die before she has the son. So he's kind of overreacting a little bit. He's not really, again, he's not really understanding. I feel like he's not listening in a way, right? Like he wasn't really listening to what the angel was saying in so many ways. He was just reacting to some of the things he thought he understood. So his wife says, if the Lord meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all the things that he did. So the woman gave birth to Samson, and Samson grew, and it said the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him while he was in the area in which he was in. So moving on to Judges 14, Samson is born. The Lord has blessed him. Go into verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah, and so there he saw a young Philistine woman. So he falls in love with this woman who, again, was somebody in general that he is not supposed to marry. However, God has a plan. This is God's plan for Samson to start some sort of war with the Philistines. And so if we go to verse 5-7, there's a couple of confusing areas for me. So if we move to 5-7, it says, Samson goes down to Timnah, with her father and mother. And as they approached the vineyards, a lion came out. And when the lion came out, he tears the lion and he leaves it for dead. So he's with his family, but then he says he doesn't tell his father or mother. And then they go down and then he talks to the woman. A little bit confusing for me because the mother and father are with him. So I don't know that he would need to tell him tell them because they were there. However, there's obviously something going on where they were there, but maybe he was in a separate area. But anyway, just noting some of the confusion in this. They were with him. They were all together, but at this point, they didn't see what happened. So then later he goes back to marry her and he sees the lion's corpse. He's not supposed to touch a lion's corpse. You are not supposed to touch a dead thing. You're considered unclean. But he goes and he takes honey out of the corpse and he goes and he eats it and he comes back and he gives it to his parents. So then he goes down. So he's ready to get married. So he says he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. So nobody knew. He's the only one who knew about this lion situation. And this is, I think, applies to the riddle. So his father went down to see the woman, and he says, when the people saw him, they chose 30 men. So he goes into this area, and it's where she lives, right? So it's all of her townspeople, essentially. He finds this woman. He loves her. He wants to marry her. He gets ready to go marry her. They choose all these people, and then he makes a bet with them. And he says, if I have a riddle for you. If you solve the riddle, you get 30 articles of clothing for me, undergarments and then clothing. And then if I do, then you give me undergarments and clothing. And so he tells this riddle, which is the riddle about what he essentially just did. Out of the eater, something to eat, out of the strong, something sweet. So we know that it is this lion that he killed and then ate honey from. They obviously don't know. So 3 days, they couldn't give the answer. And then the fourth day, they go and they sort of pester the soon-to-be wife. And they said, go find out what this riddle is so we can win these clothes. And so she badgers Samson until he gives up the story. And then she goes and she tells all the people. And then he comes in, they have the answer, and he's angry. And he says his verse is if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So he knows that his soon-to-be wife, or I believe she was maybe the wife at the time, but soon-to-be wife, no, she was his wife, she gave up the goods. And so he's definitely frustrated. And it says in the verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon them. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 of their men. So he goes to, so Timnah is one area. Ashkelon is in another area. So Ashkelon is like right near the water, and Timnah is a little bit north of that. And so he goes to Ashkelon and he kills a whole bunch of people. I assume it's Philistines. So he kills a whole bunch of people, takes all of their clothes, and then gives it to the people, the townspeople that won. And then, obviously he's furious and he's angry because he was cheated out of that win. But again, we're going to say that this is the Lord, so creating vengeance for the Philistine people. And then his wife is given away. So his wife is given to one of those 30 companions that sat with him at the feast. So if we move to Judges 15, in Judges 15, it says, later on at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson was sort of ready to reconcile with her. He brought her a young goat and he went to go visit her. And he said, I'm going to go visit her. But the father said, no, I gave her away. So again, he's furious. And again, something a little bit violent and feels somewhat brutal. And I don't know if we just treat animals differently now, but he ties the tails of foxes together, sets them on fire, and burns all this area of the Philistines as vengeance for taking his wife. So even though the dad gave her away, I guess the men who took her are the one that he took vengeance on. All of these things are slightly confusing to me, and we uh, we peg Samson as this hero, and God did set him up to take over the Philistines, right? So like God, we can see from the very beginning that that God sort of set this whole plan in motion. What I find fascinating is that this whole plan is only able to be in motion because of the actions that these people take. Am I going to say these actions are forced? I'm not. Like the falling for a woman you're not supposed to fall for, that's not abnormal, right? Being violent against people who you think are your enemy, even though they're not necessarily the ones that perpetrated the crime, also unfortunately pretty normal. So these are all human reactions that we have that could possibly be considered wrong reactions, but that God uses in order to advance his people. So he uses the in some ways the broken nature of who we are to I want to say reconcile his plan, but I feel like that's the wrong phrase, but to follow through on his plan, um, to continue with a plan in which he had for his chosen people in order for the king to come through his chosen people, right? So he's using the faults and flaws that are already in them in order to allow his plan to come to fruition. So it's in some ways a hard pill to swallow, because I know that we look at Samson like he's this super crazy hero. And I remember when I first became a believer, when I first kind of came into the church, hearing all like these are like kids' Bible stories that we tell. Like, oh, Samson, we haven't gotten this part yet, but well, we'll go to the lion. Samson killed the lion. He's so strong. He killed the lion. Well, like he wasn't supposed to go back and eat from it. Like there, there's so many things that he and the reason he was there in the first place was because he was trying to find a wife that he shouldn't have had, which was a Philistine wife. He wasn't supposed to. So anyway, I just find those things. God knows our nature as it is. He uses our nature as it is to put through his good plan, and sometimes that feels like it's a hard pill to swallow. So even as I read it, I get really frustrated with Samson, because again, he went to a whole different area and killed 30 other people because his wife uh, told his secrets. She connived them out of him, and then she wound up telling his secrets. She was supposed to be loyal to him, although she was not one of the Israelite people. She was outside of the camp, which is why he wasn't supposed to marry her in the first place. See all these things, right? So we as a people are just really supposed to follow God's plan to the absolute uttermost of our ability. I'm not even going to say the best of our ability, because we're supposed to be tapping into the Spirit in order to do it. We're not supposed to be doing it on our own strength, because we are unable. So anyway, I'm not quite finished with this, but we're close. So he goes, so he sets fire to all these things. And then, he takes the foxes, ties their tails together, sets fire to all of these areas, to all their crops and everything. And then he goes and he hides in one of the caves. So what the Philistines do is they are mad at the wife. And so they go to the wife and they set her on fire because of what Samson did. So the Philistines go, and their reaction is to set the wife and the father-in-law on fire because Samson set everything of theirs on fire. Because he says in verse 8, he attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave. Oh, after that, he attacked them viciously and then went and hid in a cave. And then in verse 9, it says the Philistines went up and camped in Judah, and they're going to fight Judah because they want Samson. So Samson's hiding in their area, and they want to go fight the people group of Judah, right? The tribe of Judah, because Samson's come in their area. So 3,000 men came from Judah, went down to the cave, and they said, don't you realize the Philistines rule over us? So Judah is in some ways content that the Philistines are ruling over us, and they're mad at Samson for fighting against the Philistines. And then in verse 12, it says, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. And Samson said, I will. You don't kill me. You bring me to them and you tie me up. And so they tied him up, and the Spirit of the Lord came on him. His ropes fell off, and he killed 1,000 Philistines that day. So again and again and again, God said he was going to use Samson, and God continued to use Samson. Even with Samson's faults, God is still continuing to use Samson. So in verse 20, it says, Samson led Israel for 20 years. But we are not done with Samson yet. So we still have more to read about him tomorrow. And that's it for today. So today, I know there was a lot going on today. There was so much more than I could even get to. So I'm hoping that you read it so you can sort of dredge anything out of it that I wasn't able to get to today. Only a short period of time. So if you like this, I want you to hit the like button. I want you to share the channel with people. I want you to subscribe to the channel so you can get it every day. And then I want you to keep reading until we come back again tomorrow.